Picture this. You're standing in the grand throne room of the Spanish royal palace in 1700 AD, watching the most powerful empire on earth crumble before your eyes. The man seated on the golden throne can barely hold his head upright. His jaw hangs open, drool pooling on his silk robes. When he tries to speak, only incomprehensible sounds emerge from his mouth. His limbs twitch uncontrollably, and his eyes stare blankly at nothing. This isn't some peasant afflicted by disease. This is Charles II of Spain, heir to the mightiest dynasty Europe has ever known, and his very existence represents the horrifying culmination of 2 centuries of calculated genetic destruction. The courtiers around you whisper nervously, their perfumed handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, not because of any offensive odor, but because they can barely stomach the sight of what their royal bloodline has produced. Foreign ambassadors shift uncomfortably, sending urgent dispatches back to their home countries about the obvious mental incapacity of the Spanish king. Everyone in this room understands the terrible truth that no one dares speak aloud. The Habsburg dynasty, the family that once controlled half the known world, has bred itself into extinction. Before diving into this tale of royal hubris and genetic catastrophe, if you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets hidden in history's shadows, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the rise and fall of empires. The story you're about to hear isn't just about one deformed king or even one doomed dynasty. It's about what happens when power becomes so concentrated, so jealously guarded, that families will sacrifice their own humanity to preserve it. The Habsburgs didn't stumble into genetic disaster by accident. They orchestrated it with methodical precision, making marriage decisions that prioritized political control over basic human biology. Each wedding ceremony, each carefully negotiated union between cousins, each strategic alliance sealed with shared blood, was another step toward the inevitable horror that would one day sit drooling on the Spanish throne. What makes this story particularly chilling is how rational it seemed at the time. The Habsburg marriage strategy wasn't born from ignorance or medieval superstition. It was calculated policy, developed by some of the most sophisticated political minds in European history. They understood that dividing their territories among different bloodlines would weaken their grip on power. They knew that marrying outside the family might introduce foreign influence into their carefully controlled empire. So they made a conscious choice to keep everything within the family circle, no matter the cost. The mathematics of their decision were as precise as they were terrifying. Every time close relatives married, the genetic risks multiplied exponentially. But the Habsburgs weren't content with occasional intermarriage. They systematized it across multiple generations, creating a feedback loop of genetic degradation that would accelerate with each passing decade. They transformed their family tree into something that resembled a twisted spider web, where the same names appeared over and over again in different branches, connected by marriages that would make a modern geneticist recoil in horror. By the time Charles II was born in 1665 AD, his family had been practicing systematic inbreeding for nearly 200 years. His parents weren't just husband and wife, they were uncle and niece. His grandparents shared multiple bloodlines. His great-grandparents were related through so many different connections that calculating his true genetic heritage required advanced mathematics. When scientists finally analyzed his family tree using modern genetic techniques, they discovered something that defied belief. Charles II was more inbred than the children of siblings would be. The physical manifestations of this genetic catastrophe were visible from the moment of his birth. The famous Habsburg jaw, which had been gradually worsening across generations, reached its most extreme form in Charles II. His lower mandible protruded so far forward that his teeth couldn't meet, making it impossible for him to chew solid food properly. His tongue was too large for his mouth, causing him to drool constantly and making his speech nearly unintelligible. His head was disproportionately large, his limbs were weak and underdeveloped, and his entire body seemed to be fighting against itself. But the physical deformities were only the beginning of Charles II's suffering. His mental development was severely delayed, and he didn't speak his first words until age 4. Even then, his communication was limited to basic sounds and gestures. He couldn't walk without assistance until age 8, and his cognitive abilities remained those of a young child throughout his entire life. The most powerful throne in Europe was occupied by a man who couldn't understand the concept of governing, let alone actually rule an empire. The Spanish court developed elaborate systems to hide the king's condition from public view. Official portraits were carefully composed to minimize his deformities. Court ceremonies were choreographed to limit his participation to brief symbolic appearances. Foreign diplomats were coached on how to interact with him in ways that wouldn't reveal the full extent of his disabilities. But whispers spread throughout European courts about the mad King of Spain, the broken man whose very existence testified to the dangers of sacrificing human health for political power. What makes Charles II's story even more tragic is that he wasn't an anomaly. He was the predictable result of a genetic experiment that had been running for generations. Earlier Habsburg rulers had shown progressively worsening symptoms of the same underlying problems. The jaw deformity had been getting more pronounced with each generation. Mental disabilities had been becoming more common. Infant mortality rates within the family had been climbing steadily. But instead of recognizing these warning signs and changing their marriage practices, the Habsburgs doubled down on their strategy of genetic isolation. The irony is almost too perfect to believe. The family that conquered empires through military genius couldn't conquer their own biology. The dynasty that accumulated vast wealth through shrewd political calculations couldn't calculate the true cost of their marriage policies. The rulers who controlled the fate of millions couldn't control the fate of their own bloodline. They had become prisoners of their own success, trapped by the very strategies that had brought them to power. As we delve deeper into this story, we'll explore how the Habsburg genetic experiment began, how it escalated across generations, and how it finally reached its horrifying conclusion in the pathetic figure of Charles II. We'll examine the specific marriages that sealed the dynasty's fate, the scientific reality behind their genetic deterioration, and the broader implications of what happens when political ambition overrides basic human biology. The decline didn't happen overnight. It was a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded across centuries, each generation more damaged than the last. To understand how the Habsburgs reached such depths of genetic horror, we must trace the methodical destruction of their bloodline, marriage by marriage, decision by decision. The rot began with Emperor Maximilian I in the late 1400s, who established the family motto that would doom his descendants. Let others wage war, you happy Austria, marry. This wasn't just clever diplomacy, it was the blueprint for genetic suicide. Maximilian understood that strategic marriages could accumulate more territory than military conquest, but he failed to grasp the biological price his family would pay for this strategy. The early Habsburg marriages seemed brilliant from a political perspective. Charles V, Maximilian's grandson, inherited an empire that stretched across Europe and into the New World through carefully orchestrated family alliances. But even Charles V was the product of first-cousin marriage, carrying genetic damage that would be passed down to future generations. When he divided his empire between his son Philip II of Spain and his brother Ferdinand of Austria, he created two separate but intertwined Habsburg lines that would spend the next century systematically intermarrying. Philip II of Spain became the architect of his family's genetic doom. Married 4 times, he understood that maintaining Habsburg dominance required keeping power within the family circle. His final marriage in 1570 AD to his 20-year-old niece Anna of Austria set the template for disaster. Anna wasn't just his niece, but also his first cousin once removed, related to him through multiple bloodlines. Their union produced Philip III, who inherited an inbreeding coefficient already elevated beyond safe levels. The mathematical precision of genetic degradation is as terrifying as it is predictable. Each time close relatives reproduce, harmful recessive genes have a higher chance of being expressed in their children. Normal human populations maintain genetic diversity that masks these dangerous mutations. But the Habsburgs systematically eliminated that protective diversity generation after generation until their bloodline became a concentrated repository of genetic defects. Philip III, born from this toxic union, married Margaret of Austria in 1599 AD. Margaret was simultaneously his first cousin and his sister-in-law's sister, related to him through so many family connections that their relationship defied simple description. Their son, Philip IV, entered the world with an inbreeding coefficient that would have been alarming in any other family, but was simply business as usual for the Habsburgs. By the time Philip IV took the throne, the physical manifestations of genetic damage were becoming impossible to ignore. His jaw showed clear signs of the Habsburg deformity, making eating and speaking difficult. His mental capacity, while not severely compromised, displayed the subtle cognitive decline that would become more pronounced in future generations. Yet instead of recognizing these warning signs, Philip IV made the decision that would seal his dynasty's fate. In 1649 AD, at age 44, Philip IV married his 15-year-old niece, Mariana of Austria. This wasn't just another political alliance, it was the marriage that would produce Charles II, the living embodiment of everything that could go wrong when human genetics are treated as a political tool. Mariana had originally been betrothed to Philip IV's son, Prince Balthazar Charles, but when the prince died young, the family simply reassigned her to his father. The 29-year age difference was irrelevant. What mattered was keeping the bloodline pure and the inheritance within the family. The union of Philip IV and Mariana produced several children, but most died in infancy or early childhood, their bodies too weak to sustain life. Philip Prospero, born in 1657 AD, was hailed as the heir to the Spanish throne, but his health was precarious from birth. Contemporary accounts describe a child who struggled to walk, spoke with difficulty, and suffered from frequent seizures. When he died at age 4 in 1661 AD, the Spanish court was left desperately hoping for another heir. The pressure on Queen Mariana to produce a surviving son was immense. The Spanish Empire, already weakened by military defeats and economic decline, needed strong leadership to maintain its position in European politics. But the genetic odds were stacked against any child born from their union. Their inbreeding coefficient was so high that any offspring would be at extreme risk for genetic disorders, physical deformities, and mental disabilities. Into this context of desperation and genetic catastrophe, Charles II was born on November 6, 1665 AD. The labour was difficult and prolonged, with Queen Mariana experiencing complications that nearly cost both mother and child their lives. When the infant finally emerged, the attending physicians immediately recognized that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just another sickly royal baby. This was the inevitable result of 2 centuries of systematic genetic destruction. Charles II's condition was so severe that modern genetic analysis reveals he had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than children born to sibling parents. Every harmful mutation that had accumulated in the Habsburg bloodline over the centuries was expressed in his tortured body. He suffered from mandibular prognathism, mental retardation, epilepsy, and various metabolic disorders that made normal life impossible. The Spanish court struggled desperately to maintain the fiction that Charles II was a normal, healthy heir. Official portraits were carefully composed to minimize his deformities. Court ceremonies were choreographed to hide his limitations. Foreign ambassadors were briefed on how to interact with the king without embarrassing the royal family, but the charade became increasingly difficult to maintain as Charles II aged. His marriage to Marie-Louise of Orleans in 1679 AD was a diplomatic necessity that became a personal tragedy. The young French princess was beautiful and healthy, everything Charles II was not. Contemporary accounts describe her terror at meeting her husband and her growing despair as she realized he would never be capable of fathering children. After 10 years of marriage without producing an heir, she died suddenly at age 26. Many suspected from the psychological strain of her impossible situation. Charles II's second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg in 1690 AD was even more desperate. But like his first marriage, this union was incapable of producing the heir Spain desperately needed. The king's physical and mental condition continued to deteriorate throughout his 30s, his body aging rapidly under the burden of genetic defects. When Charles II finally died on November 1st, 1700 AD, at the age of 39, he took the Spanish Habsburg line with him. The empire his ancestors had built through strategic marriages was left without an heir, triggering the War of the Spanish Succession that would reshape European politics for the next decade. The genetic experiment that had begun with such confidence had ended in complete failure. The autopsy of Charles II's body revealed the full extent of the genetic catastrophe. His organs were described as putrefied and corrupted, his brain smaller than normal, his digestive system severely malformed, and his reproductive organs so underdeveloped that he could never have fathered children. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty had literally bred itself out of existence, but perhaps the most lasting impact of the Habsburg genetic disaster was the lesson it taught about the dangers of concentrating power so intensely that families will sacrifice their own humanity to preserve it. The same royal houses that had watched the Spanish Habsburgs destroy themselves through inbreeding began reconsidering their own marriage practices. The extreme genetic isolation that had characterized European nobility for centuries started giving way to more diverse patterns, though change was gradual and often met with resistance. The throne room, where our story began, now stands empty of its drooling occupant, but the lesson remains carved in stone and written in blood. Some victories come at prices too terrible to pay, and some experiments in human genetics produce monsters rather than kings. The Habsburgs conquered empires but couldn't conquer their own biology. They accumulated vast wealth but bankrupted their genetic heritage. They ruled over millions but couldn't rule over the simple mathematics of heredity. In the end, the dynasty that proclaimed, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry," discovered that some wars are fought in the bedroom rather than the battlefield, and that some defeats are written in DNA rather than history books. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, remains history's most powerful reminder that political ambition, no matter how sophisticated, cannot overcome the fundamental laws of human biology.